Wyoming Territory, July 1878. The sun beat down on the dusty town of Casper as 30 men stood around a wooden platform, eyes cold, voices louder than they needed to be. She ain't but trouble. No family, no name. No prospects, barked a man in a sweat-stained vest, slapping his hand on the auction post. Unwanted, that is her lot. Zadie Elloway stood barefoot, wrists tied with coarse rope, a faded blue dress hanging off her thin shoulders. She was 21, and not long ago she had belonged somewhere. But after the plague took her parents in Missouri, she had been sold off by a man who claimed to be her uncle he was not. He'd pocketed the silver, and she'd been dragged west in a freight wagon like cattle. Now she was up for auction, like a mule too stubborn to be broken. $2, someone sneered from the back. Laughter followed. Zadie stared straight ahead, jaw set. She had not spoken in 2 days. She would not beg. Then, through the dust and noise, a tall man stepped forward, boots heavy on the boards. He looked younger than the rest, maybe 27, with dark sun-browned skin, a steady walk, and a scar that ran through his left eyebrow. His hat shaded his eyes, but when he looked at her, she felt it. $5, he said. His voice was low, but it cut through the noise like a whip crack. The men turned to look at him. "You crazy boy," someone called. "She ain't worth that." The man said nothing. He took the coins from his coat pocket and laid them on the table. Then he stepped up and cut the rope from her wrists with a pocket knife. "What's your name?" he asked her. She stared at him, unsure if this was another game. He didn't wait. "You do not look like Unwanted to me," he said softly. "You look like someone who deserves better. I'm Isaiah Keaton." She still said nothing. He reached over gently, not touching her, just holding his hand out. "You need a place to go. I have a ranch north of here. You can come if you want." She looked at his hand for a long moment. Then, slowly, she took it. They rode out of Casper an hour later. She sat side saddle on a chestnut mare he called Maple, while he led the way on a black gelding named Flint. Neither of them spoke much. The ranch was a half-day ride into wide, open country rolling hills, tall grass, wind that never stopped moving. The house was small but solid, built by Isaiah's hands 6 years ago after his father died. He showed her the stable, the pump well, the chicken coop. "You can have the spare room," he said, nodding toward the back of the house. "It is not much, but it is yours." That night she stood outside alone, arms folded tight as she looked up at the stars. She could hear Isaiah inside, moving about quietly. She did not understand why he had helped her, but she was not called Unwanted anymore. The next morning she found a stack of folded clothes on the table. There was breakfast, 2 eggs, hot corn cake, and a jar of wild honey. "You do not have to stay," Isaiah told her as he sipped his coffee. "But if you want to, there is work here. I could use the help." Zadie nodded once. "I want to." It was the first thing she had said to him. He looked at her then, really looked. "All right," he said. Weeks passed. The land was harsh, but the days had rhythm, feeding the animals, tending the garden, fixing fences. Zadie worked like someone who had something to prove. Isaiah watched her, always from a respectful distance. But he noticed everything. The way she smiled at the chickens when she thought no one was looking. The way she stood on the porch at night, quiet and still, like she was listening for something she missed. One evening, after a long day repairing the south fence, she came into the kitchen, cheeks flushed, hands scraped. "You could have waited," he told her. "I wanted to help." He poured her a cup of water and leaned against the table. "You do not have to work so hard to earn staying here." "I am not trying to earn it." She looked up at him then. I do not want to be useless." Isaiah set the cup down. "Zadie, you are not useless. You are not unwanted, not here." She blinked hard. Then she nodded and turned away, pretending to fix a loose button on her sleeve. That night, he carved her name into the wooden beam above the kitchen door, slowly, carefully, like it had always belonged there. Zadie. The next morning, she saw it. She stood there for a long while, fingers brushing over the letters. When he walked in, she was smiling, a small thing, but real. "I like my name," she said. He smiled back. "Good, it suits you." From then on, something shifted. They started sitting together on the porch after supper, watching the sun go down. He would tell her stories about his father, and she would tell him quiet pieces of her past, not all of it, but enough. She learned he had lost his mother young. That he had been running the ranch on his own since he was 21. That he had no siblings, no kin left but the land under his boots. One night she asked, "Why did you buy me?" Isaiah looked at her for a long moment. "Because I saw someone who had been thrown away. And I know what that feels like." She looked down at her hands. "You did not have to take me in." "I know," he said, "but I wanted to." And that was the truth. By the end of summer, she no longer looked like the girl who had stood on that auction block. She had color in her cheeks. She smiled more. She laughed sometimes. And Isaiah, he had not expected to feel so much so fast. But every time she laughed, every time she looked at him like he was someone good, he felt it deeper. One morning, as they were walking the fence line together, she stopped and said, "You gave me back my name, but you also gave me back myself." He looked at her then, and for the first time he reached for her hand. She did not pull away, not even when he laced his fingers through hers. Not even when the wind picked up and the prairie stretched out before them like forever. The first frost came early that year. It crept in one dawn without warning, silvery and thin, laying itself quiet across the grass and fence rails. Zadie stepped outside with a shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, her breath clouding in the air. She paused beside the porch rail, fingers brushing the moisture from the wood. Her boots left shallow prints in the thin crust of rime as she walked toward the barn. Inside, Isaiah was already saddling Flint. He glanced up when she entered, nodding once, a piece of hay tucked in the corner of his mouth. "I was going to check the creek fence," he said. "South side, some posts were leaning yesterday." "I'll come," she said. "If you've got gloves to spare." He tugged a second pair from the saddlebag and handed them to her. They were too big, worn soft, and smelled faintly of pine tar. She pulled them on without comment. They rode in silence for a while, the air cold enough to sting. The land was changing, grasses brittle, cottonwoods pale gold. The cattle moved slower now, gathering in tighter groups when the wind kicked up. At the creek, the fence slumped where a cottonwood root had pushed up beneath it. Isaiah dismounted and pulled a coil of wire from his saddlebag. Zadie knelt beside him, steadying the post while he worked the wire taut. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked, not looking up. "Sometimes," he said, twisting the wire tight, "but I never get far with the idea. There's nowhere else that feels like it's mine." She nodded slowly, then shifted her weight to the other knee. "I used to think I'd end up back east, in a town, somewhere with lamps in the windows and music on Sundays." He glanced at her then, but her eyes were focused on the fence. "You miss it?" "I miss what I thought it would be, not what it was." She paused, then added, "I never got to be useful there." "You are here," he said simply. When they finished the repair, they sat a while on a flat stone near the creek. The water moved slow now, edged with ice in the shadows. Zadie picked up a thin stick and drew lines in the dirt. "I dreamed last night," she said after a while. "There was a room full of light. I was carrying a bowl of water and no one tried to take it from me. No one told me I didn't belong." Isaiah didn't say anything at first. Then he said, "You carry yourself like it's always about to be taken, even now." She looked over at him. "I suppose I do." He met her gaze. "You don't have to." That night, she stayed up late, sitting by the hearth with a piece of linen stretched taut in a hoop. Her needle moved slowly, careful and quiet. Isaiah had loaned her his mother's thread box without a word that afternoon, setting it on the table before heading out to chop wood. It was the first thing he'd given her that had once belonged to someone else in his life. The embroidery was crooked, the stitches uneven, but she kept at it. She was sewing a small bluebird on the corner of a hand towel. She didn't know why, except that it looked like something that might belong in a house meant to be kept. Isaiah returned just after dark, arms dusted with wood shavings. He paused in the doorway when he saw her, lit by the fire glow, head bent over her work. "I remember that box," he said, setting the kindling down. "My mother used to fix the cuffs on my shirts with that same red thread." Zadie looked up. "I didn't mean to take it without asking." "You didn't take it," he said. "I left it." She set the hoop down. "I never knew how to sew proper. I was taught just enough to mend a hem, not to make anything new." "You're making something now," he said. "That counts." They ate dinner at the table without much talk, but it wasn't silence that pressed on them, it was something gentler, like waiting for a kettle to boil. Afterward, she washed the dishes while he stoked the fire. When he passed behind her, he paused just long enough to say, "You look steadier these days." She dried her hands on her apron. I don't feel like I'm waiting to disappear anymore. He nodded once and stepped out onto the porch. She followed a few minutes later, the air colder now. He handed her a mug of warm cider. I've been thinking, he said, eyes on the horizon, about planting more rows next spring, maybe corn, maybe squash. She sipped slowly. I could help. I was hoping you'd say that. They stood shoulder to shoulder, watching the sky deepen. The stars came out one by one, steady and bright. He didn't reach for her hand again, but she kept standing close, not moving away when the wind picked up. That night, before she went to bed, she folded the towel with the bluebird and set it on the shelf above the sink. When Isaiah came in later, he saw it there and paused. He didn't say anything about it. But he left a small wooden box on her bedside table the next morning with needles, thimbles, and a ribbon the color of dusk. The wind had a different weight in November. It no longer wandered, it pushed. Isaiah stood near the barn roof, hammer in hand, replacing a board that had loosened in the night. Below, Zadie was raking dry brush into a pile by the shed, her sleeves rolled and her braid tucked beneath a wool cap he hadn't seen her wear before. It was faded green, frayed at the brim. When he climbed down, she pointed toward the hills. There were boot tracks along the back fence, deep ones. Not yours. Isaiah wiped his hands with a cloth. You sure they weren't from before the rain? They cut through fresh mud. The heel marks held. He nodded once and headed toward the house. Inside, he loaded 2 shells into the rifle that leaned by the door, then paused. You don't need to worry. But I'll walk the ridgeline before supper. Zadie didn't flinch. I'll set out a lantern, in case you come back after dark. That evening, she kept her hands busy, not with thread but with corn husks, pulling them into strips and weaving them into a small mat. She worked by firelight, the lantern on the sill casting a soft glow toward the hills. Isaiah returned with his coat damp and his boots caked in frost. He leaned the rifle near the door, unbothered. Nothing fresh past the fence, he said, shrugging out of his coat. Might have been a drifter cutting through. Zadie said nothing, but her shoulders eased. She handed him a bowl of stew. You ever think of hiring a hand? She asked as he sat. I have, but no one I trust out here. And I'd rather not bring someone in unless I have to. She stirred her own bowl gently. You trust me with the ranch. I already do. The words landed without ceremony. She looked across the table, then back at her bowl. The fire cracked softly in the hearth. I've never been trusted with anything worth keeping, she said after a while. Isaiah drew a breath. You've kept this place steady. That's worth more than the fence or the stock. She didn't speak again until the stew cooled. Later, while Isaiah patched the lining of his saddlebag near the fire, Zadie knelt beside the hearth and took out a small, folded paper wrapped in string. She unwrapped it slowly and held it out. My mother embroidered this before I was born. It was stitched into my baby blanket. I cut it out before I was taken. Isaiah set the saddlebag aside. The cloth was small, barely the size of his palm, with faded pink thread forming a tiny sprig of lavender. I kept it, she said, even when I had to trade the blanket. He didn't reach for it. You want it back where it belongs, she nodded once. I think the towel I made could use it. He stood and brought down the towel, still folded neatly on the shelf. He didn't say anything as he handed it to her. She stitched the cloth into the corner, careful and slow, the tip of her tongue just visible between her teeth as she worked. When she finished, she turned the towel toward him. Isaiah traced the edge of the lavender with his thumb. You've tied yourself to this place, he said quietly. She looked up at him. And to you, he didn't look away. You already have. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the shutter once before settling into a hush. Zadie stood and laid the towel back in its place, smoothing it flat. Isaiah stepped beside her. You could stay. Not just for the winter. Her voice didn't waver. I want to. He drew in a breath, steady and low, then reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered a moment longer than they needed to. I'll fix the back gate tomorrow, he said. Zadie nodded. I'll be there. They stood together in the quiet of the kitchen, the scent of ash and bread and cold wind between them. Nothing rushed, nothing uncertain, just 2 people who had found solid ground in the same patch of prairie. A week before the first snow, Isaiah brought down a box from the loft above the barn. It was cedar, square, and bound with an iron latch dulled by time. He carried it to the house without comment and set it on the table between them after supper. Zadie leaned forward, wiping her hands on her skirt. "What's in it?" He unlatched the box and lifted the lid. Inside, there were small bundles of folded letters tied with twine, a rolled map, and a pair of gloves worn smooth at the palms. "My father's," he said. He kept records of every deal, every bit of land he worked. "There's a note in here about the stream rights that run past the eastern edge, said they were disputed once." She touched the map gently, careful not to crease the edges. "Why now?" Isaiah drew out a folded piece of parchment, yellowed and brittle near the corners. "There's a man in Rawlins. Claims he's buying up water access through this region. Sent word last week." Zadie's brow furrowed. "You didn't mention it. I wanted to see what we still had in writing before I worried you over it." She looked up at him, steady. "It's my worry too now." He nodded once, then passed her the letter. It was signed with a name she didn't recognize, but the tone was sharp, a demand dressed as a request. "He's expecting to come through by December," Isaiah said. "I'll ride into town in the morning, speak with the clerk. I'll come with you." He glanced at her, surprised. "It's a long ride and cold." "I've made colder ones," she said, "and this concerns both of us." They left early with the sky low and gray. The trail to Rawlins was frozen in places, the grasses bowed under a thin crust of ice. Zadie wore Isaiah's second coat, sleeves rolled back, the collar lined with old fleece that still held his scent. As they rode, she asked, "Did you ever want something different than this?" He kept his eyes ahead. "I used to think I'd travel, maybe south, maybe west to see the ocean, but nothing felt like it would hold me, not the way this land does." She was quiet for a moment. "Then, I used to think I'd marry a man who made clocks. I don't know why. I just liked the idea of someone who understood how time fit together." He smiled faintly. "And now I think maybe time doesn't need to be fixed. Just lived." They reached Rawlins by midday and tied their horses outside the land office. Inside, the clerk was a thin man with spectacles that slid down his nose. Isaiah handed over the deed and the map. Zadie stood beside him, eyes sharp. The clerk examined the papers, frowning. "Water rights were included with the property when your father signed in '71. Unless he sold them separately, they're still yours." "He didn't sell anything," Isaiah said. "Then you've got nothing to fear," Zadie asked. "What if this man tries to take it anyway?" The clerk shrugged. "Then you've got the law on your side. But out here, law don't always reach as fast as trouble does." They rode back with the wind behind them. The sun broke through once near the ridgeline, casting long shadows across the snow-dusted hills. That night, Zadie laid the map flat on the table and traced the stream line with her fingertip. "I think we should build a marker," she said. "A stone cairn like your father used to mark grazing lines." Isaiah nodded. "We'll do it together." She smiled, then hesitated. "I've never built anything meant to last." "You built trust," he said. "Built a home out of nothing but grit and your own 2 hands." She looked at him then, something soft flickering behind her eyes. "You made me feel like I could." He stepped close, slow and certain. "You did it yourself." "I just made room." Her breath caught, but she didn't look away. "I want to stay, Isaiah, not just for the land or the work, for you." He reached for her hand, rough fingers curling around hers. "Then stay, not as a guest, not as someone passing through." She met his eyes. "As what then?" He lifted her hand to his chest, over the steady thrum of his heart. "As the one I build this life with, if you'll have it." She nodded once, lips trembling just enough to show how deeply she meant it. "I will." They stood there as the fire burned low, the map still open, the future traced between their hands. Outside, the wind settled. Inside, a beginning took root. The wind carried snow before it settled, light enough to sweep away, but steady. Zadie stepped down from the porch with her shawl drawn close and a basket in her arms. She moved carefully, placing seed along the cleared path behind the barn where the birds still came, even now. Isaiah had carved a small perch along the fence rail, and she'd taken to watching them in the morning's quiet, soot-feathered things that didn't ask for anything but space to land. Inside, Isaiah finished smoothing the corners of a fresh-cut board for the cradle he was building. He hadn't said the word out loud, but she knew. Knew by the way he measured the slats twice before cutting, by the soft rasp of sandpaper against pine. He wasn't one to announce things. He made them. When she came back in, cheeks pink and eyes bright, she paused beside him without speaking. Her hand rested on the edge of the cradle frame, fingers brushing a knot in the wood. "We'll need to line it with wool before the freeze sets in," she said. Isaiah nodded. "I can shear the last 2 ewes this week. There's time." She leaned against the beam near the hearth and watched him work. "I didn't think I'd ever get to have anything that was mine and safe." "You do now," he said, not looking up. "You always will." That night they sat close on the rug before the fire, a quilt tucked over their knees. She held a piece of muslin stretched in a hoop again, but her hands moved slower now, more careful. She was stitching a spray of prairie clover, tiny, precise petals in faded purple. "Isaiah," she said, her voice quiet, "do you ever think about what comes after this?" He turned toward her. "After what? After the planting, after the calves, after the fences and the winters." He thought for a long moment. "I think about growing old here, watching the trees lean heavier each year, maybe building a second barn if the herd grows. I think about you beside me through all of it." Her fingers stilled. "You've never asked what name I'd take. I figured I'd ask when you told me you were ready." "I am." He reached for her hand. "Then be mine in name too," she smiled, the kind that reached her eyes. "Zadie Keaton," she said, testing the sound. "That sits right." They married in the small clapboard church 10 miles east, where the preacher came through every third Sunday. The pews were half-full ranchers, neighbors, the woman who sold candles and soap from her wagon. Isaiah wore his best shirt, and Zadie stitched lace trim onto her dress the night before, hands steady. Afterward, they rode home slow under a pale sky, the snow soft and bright around them. When they reached the house, Isaiah lifted her down from Maple and held her close, his breath warm against her cheek. "I never thought I'd have this," he said. "You do," she whispered. "You have me, you always will." The seasons passed. Spring came late, but it came. The cradle sat by the window, its frame smooth and lined with soft wool, just as they'd planned. Zadie sang while she worked now, low and tuneless, but full of comfort. Isaiah built shelves for her jars, and she filled them preserves, herbs, dried berries. Their days held rhythm, not repetition. He taught her how to read the sky for storms, and she showed him how to mend shirts without puckering the seams. He planted wheat in the north field, and she kept a kitchen garden along the south wall. They did not speak often of the past. It had shaped them, but it did not own them. Their marriage was quiet and steady, like the land they worked hard earned, deeply rooted, and simple in the best way. In time, they welcomed their first child, a girl named Ada. She was born just after dusk, with the wind still and the stars just beginning to show. Isaiah held her in his arms and whispered the only lullaby he remembered from his father's voice. Zadie watched from the bed, her eyes wet but peaceful. Years passed, marked by harvests and birthdays, and the slow stretch of time lived well. The ranch grew not fast but strong. They added a small room to the house, then another. Isaiah taught Ada to ride, and Zadie taught her to sew. On Sundays, they read aloud near the fire, each taking turns, even when the words came slow. One autumn, as the leaves turned and the hills glowed gold, Zadie stood outside with her daughter, watching Isaiah cut fence posts across the pasture. Ada reached for her hand without speaking. "Did you love him right away?" Ada asked. Zadie smiled, eyes on the man in the field. "I didn't know it at first, but he made room for me. He saw who I was before I could say it myself." Ada nodded, thoughtful. "You look happiest when you say his name." "I am," she said, "because everything that came before led me here. And here is where I was always meant to be." Inside, Isaiah lit the lanterns and warmed cider on the stove. He glanced toward the window and saw them standing together, framed by the last light of day. He didn't call them in right away. He just watched quietly, the way a man does when he knows he has everything he ever hoped for, and he did. They all did. Together, they lived a life that wasn't grand, but it was theirs, full of quiet strength, hard-earned joy, and the kind of love that never needed to be spoken to be known.